Today we'll be hearing from Professor Christofilis Megides in a lecture titled The Demise of Democracy, Lessons from Ancient Athens. With over 35 years of experience in archaeology, teaching, and administration, Professor Christofilis Megides is a faculty member at the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C., president of the Mycenaean Foundation, and field director of excavations at Mycenae and Lamia. Throughout his career, Professor Megides has combined academic leadership with a commitment to innovative teaching and interdisciplinary research. He earned a BA at the University of Athens, PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, and completed postdoctoral research at Brown University. Professor Megides taught at Campus College and the University of Indianapolis, Athens, Greece, and held a distinguished Christopher Roberts Chair in Archaeology at Dickinson College for 2 decades, where he created and chaired the Department of Archaeology, designed the archaeology academic curriculum, and directed study abroad programs. In 2022, Professor Megides joined the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C., where he teaches at graduate level and directs Hermes, the Institute Study Abroad program in Greece. If you're interested in this program, please email us at events.iwp@iwp.edu, and we will connect you to the correct person who will help you get into that program. Professor Megides has taught nearly 3,000 students, developed 70 courses, and mentored 200 undergraduate and graduate students. His teaching spans the ancient Mediterranean, Aegean, Greek, Roman, Anatolia, and the Near East, covering topics such as archaeology, art, architecture, anthropology, religion, politics, society and economy, warfare, technology, urbanization, environment, cultural heritage, archaeological theory, and archaeological science. His research focuses on Minoan and Mycenaean archaeology, classical Greek art and architecture, and archaeological methodology. With 40 years of field experience, Professor Megides has led excavations at prominent sites in Greece, including Mycenae, Glass, and the Spercheios Valley, making significant discoveries and directing acclaimed field schools that trained over 450 students from 44 universities worldwide. Megides has secured substantial external and institutional funding for his research and fieldwork, about $2.8 million, and his findings have been widely disseminated in scholarly publications and international media. His scholarly publications comprise 26 articles, numerous field reports, 1 book submitted for publication, and 3 forthcoming books. Furthermore, Professor Megides has presented 45 international conference papers and delivered 42 invited lectures at prestigious universities and institutes worldwide. With that, please join me in welcoming Professor Christofilis Megides. If anyone has a question, please use the Q&A function and we will get to it as soon as possible.
Thank you, Shannon. Greetings from Greece. Thank you all for joining. It's a great privilege to be invited to give a lecture in the lecture series of the IWP. This podium offers an opportunity to many distinguished scholars to address an engaging, informed, and educated audience on current issues of national security, international politics, and diplomacy. The topic of my lecture today could not be more current and relevant amidst the global political turmoil of our century and the perpetual struggle of democracy against totalitarianism, but also contra its own internal structural and ideological faults, the very same faults that caused the decline and fall of democracy the first time around in ancient Athens some 2,300 years ago. Therefore, historical and political lessons from ancient Athens on the ideology and pathology of democracy may be invaluable as we strive to avoid repeating all mistakes and heading towards the same dead end. To navigate forward, we first need to study our past. The structure of, let me go to my slides. The structure of this lecture will be as follows. At the beginning, we will talk about the birth of democracy with a brief analysis of the interacting factors and variables that led to the morphogenesis of the new constitution. We'll talk then about the principles and ideology of democracy, the control and integration mechanisms, political pathology of democracy, and finally, the future of democracy. Aristotle, in his Politics, classified the different types of political constitutions according to a hierarchical quantity, the rule of one, the rule of few, the rule of majority, and hierarchical quality, authentic and degenerate constitutions. According to this scheme, monarchy degenerates to tyranny, allegedly because a monarch with hereditary power would be more inclined to provide for his subjects, by contrast with a tyrant whose main preoccupation is how to remain in power. Aristocracy, the rule of nobility, or of the aristoi, the best, degenerates to oligarchy, the rule of a few wealthy and powerful, and politia, by which he means true democracy, degenerates to democracy, by which he means ochlocracy. Diachronically, the chronological development of political institutions in ancient Greece starts with monarchy in Mycenaean times and the early Iron Age Greece, then transitions to aristocracy in the 9th and 8th century BC, and eventually into oligarchy, followed by tyranny in the 7th and 6th century BC, in the Archaic period, until the emergence of politia, what we call democracy, in 507 BC, that soon degenerates into ochlocracy in the 4th century BC. And in turn, this declines and falls with the return of monarchy under Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic kingdoms. Let's start first with part one, which is the morphogenesis. Democracy first emerged in ancient Athens in 507 BC, following a long and turbulent period of aristocracy and tyranny, when a nexus of intertwined geopolitical, sociopolitical, economic, and cultural developments led to the morphogenesis of the new political institution. The interacting factors and variables are those listed on your slide: geopolitics, landscape and environment, political, economic, social factors, changes in military and warfare tactics, changes in athletics, and the great change in writing and education. Geopolitics played a significant role as the strategic location of Greece in the crossroads of sea and land trade routes in the Mediterranean, a true gateway between three continents, facilitated multicultural contacts and integration of foreign influences. Landscape and environment also synergized to this effect, as the limited land resources and severe environmental constraints of arable land led the Greeks to seafaring and commerce, which led to the trade of commodities, but more importantly, to the exchange of ideas. Furthermore, the mountainous landscape of Greece that divides the land into smaller regions imposed political fragmentation in small, sustainable, and manageable units, as well as strong regionalism. Both centrifugal forces impeding the formation of large dominant empires, such as the ones in Egypt and Mesopotamia, which were formed in the vast fertile valleys of the Nile or the Tigris and the Euphrates. Political developments following the decline and fall of the Mycenaean world caused political fragmentation of large palace states and the emergence of what we call the polis, city-state, as the main political unit from the 9th to the 4th century BC. The city-state was small-sized, self-sufficient, autonomous and independent, urban-centric, with culturally integrated homogeneous population, and a very well-defined socioeconomic structure, which would be eventually dominated by a rising middle class. Economic developments in the Archaic period, in the 7th and the 6th century BC, such as the shift from agriculture to trade-based economy, the emergence of coinage, and the change from barter to currency economy, led to the accumulation of portable wealth in the hands of merchants, sailors, craftsmen, artisans, manufacturers. All of these formed, for the very first time in world history, a middle class, and eventually a new aristocracy of wealth, democracy, as opposed to the landlords and the aristocracy of birth. These economic changes fueled a creeping social strife and power struggle between the elite, the nobility, and the mass, the middle and lower classes, and triggered dramatic socio-political developments in the 6th century BC. The demands for justice and equal political rights were initially advanced by recorded legislation, what we call nomos, that replaced customary law or thesmos. Lycurgus did this in Sparta, Dracon in Athens, and eventually by a political compromise for democracy, which was an achievement of Solon in Athens at the beginning of the 6th century BC. The course towards liberalism was briefly interrupted by tyranny in Athens, by Pisistratus, and other city-states. We have Phaedon in Argos, Periander in Corinth, Polycrates in Samos, and so on, in the 7th and the 6th centuries BC. Tyranny, however, broke down aristocratic allegiance and solidarity, thus empowering the mass over the elite, as the tyrant needed to earn the acceptance or at least the tolerance of the people. The fall of tyranny in Athens led to the establishment of democracy by Cleisthenes in 507 BC, a progressive and a liberal political constitution that marked a new era, that of the domination of a rising middle class. Parallel developments in warfare, athletics, and education were also instrumental in the emergence of democracy. In the 6th century BC, changes and advances in military tactics and equipment, phalanx and the triremes, shifted the defense of the polis from the hands of the nobles, who had the cavalry and the chariots, to the hands of the middle and the lower class citizens. The need for well-trained armies of citizens and the extension of the right of participation to all Greeks, irrespective of class or wealth status, led to a change in athletics, which had originally started in 776 BC as a prerogative of aristocracy and as an expression of aristocratic ideology, the en aristevin, always be the best. The athletic facilities of the polis, the palestra and the gymnasium, promoted socioeconomic integration of the population and established equality between social classes. Athletes competed in the nude, stripped of all socioeconomic or ethnic distinctions, and were judged solely on merit and ability. Athletics became an outlet for social tensions, while physical contact during training or competition facilitated familiarization between people of different classes, acceptance, and eventually integration in the democratic polis. At the pan-Hellenic level, the stadium became an alternative to war, an arena for personal, social, and ethnic distinction, as well as a platform for cultural and ethnic integration of all Greeks. Last but not least, the development of the Greek alphabet since the 8th century BC. In this case, the Greek alphabet has 26 letters that replace, the hundreds of syllabograms of other scripts, or the tens of thousands of ideograms of hieroglyphic scripts. So with 20 or 26, up to 26 letters, it's quite easy to learn how to read and write. That facilitated the dissemination of writing in Greek society, enabled written communication in law, politics, religion, trade, and art, and scientific research and literature. And above all, it expanded the privilege of education, which was diachronically a prerogative of aristocracy, among the citizens of the democratic polis. A very good example, look at the three photographs in this slide. On the top left, you got an inscription, and we have inscriptions with laws and decrees that were placed in the Agora and on the Acropolis, so that the citizens are always informed of the law. No ignorance of law was accepted. And this tells us that, the majority of the Athenian citizens could, with some basic difficulty, but they could read, and most of them could write as well. In the bottom photo, you can see the pride of the middle class in identifying themselves. Look at the inscription of the vase. Exikias me epoese. Exikias made me. It's not Exikias who speaks, but it is the object, the creation, that talks about its creator. So we have a pride, an eponymous, signature, by contrast with the anonymity that we see in other great cultures of the time or before the Greeks. Finally, the ostracism, you can see the ostraca on the top right. That's a vivid illustration and manifestation of the power of the mass over the elite. We're going to return to the topic of ostracism in a few minutes. Therefore, all the cumulative effect of all these interacting factors and variables gave rise to the first democracy in the world, while a similar nexus of socio-political, economic, and cultural developments led to the revival of democracy at the turn of the 19th century AD. In the United States in 1787, in France 1789, and Greece 1821. And let's move now to the principles and the political ideology of democracy. Athenian democracy formulated the political ideology and the fundamental principles that were later canonized by modern democracies. It formalized defensive mechanisms against undue concentration of power and employed innovative integrative mechanisms to propagate its ideology and educate the citizens. Three famous phrases provide insight into the complex perspective of democracy and the different and variable perceptions of its function. Democracy, the government of the people, by the people, for the people, Abraham Lincoln. In democracy, the people win power by the vote of the many, are governed by the ability of a few, and do great by rising to the inspiration of one, Eleftherios Venizelos, Greek prime minister. And then, of course, in word, there was democracy, means in Athens, but in fact, it was the first man's rule. He means Pericles, and that's Thucydides, and the Athenian historian. So you can see how different, the perceptions of democracy can be. The main principles of democracy, according to Aristotle in his Politics, include isonomia, equality before the law, isigoria, equal right to voice an opinion, paresia, which is the freedom of speech, eleftheria, the freedom of action, ευθύνα, accountability, plioψηφία, the majority rule, tripartite division of the government, hundreds of years, thousands of years before Montesquieu suggested it, legislative, executive, judicial, and the fundamental principle of the all-powerful demos. Everybody accepts that the demos is all-powerful. Public officials are empowered by the people to govern and are accountable to the People's Assembly or the Ecclesia. So that's extremely close to the government of the people, by the people, for the people. Democracy is all about maintaining procedures that safeguard a defined frame for a conflict of ideas, not a conflict of people, through dialectics and compromise of conflicting interests. Based on that, there was an Athenian social contract. It was not written, but it was a compromise, an unwritten compromise with mutual concessions. The elite accept political equality. The people acknowledge socioeconomic inequality, but tax wealth. And both parties agree on the axiomatic principle of the power of the people and the exclusion of violence. Therefore, the Athenian democracy was a political constitution of fine balance between inherent contradictions and conflicting elements. Mass versus elite, sovereign demos versus sovereign law, freedom versus concession, collective good versus personal happiness, political equality versus socioeconomic inequality, idealism versus pragmatism, democracy versus imperialism, a dilemma that Athens and Rome faced in very different ways from each other. And in modern times, the same dilemma was faced by England, by France, and the United States. Now, democracy, and we're moving to the control mechanisms, democracy is based on the realistic admission that absolute power corrupts even the best of people, regardless of good intentions or holy aims. The ancient Athenians set in place several control mechanisms to avert undue concentration of power and safeguard democracy. It's exactly what we call checks and balances. What were the control mechanisms in ancient Athens? Election by lot and or vote. Office eligibility disconnected from economic or social status. Limited time of service, 1 year. an alternation in power, maximum 2 non-consecutive terms. Salary for public offices, a motivation for poor citizens, and a preventive measure against corruption. Principle of collectivity in public offices, what we call collective bodies. And here on the photograph, you see a lot machine. In the slots, they would insert these bronze small tablets inscribed with the names of the eligible citizens. And then on the far left, there would be a tube where they would channel white and black pebbles. Any line that would be aligned with white pebbles, they would be called to service. Any line aligned with a black pebble would be dismissed for the day. Other control mechanisms, eligibility screenings, dokimasia, monthly confirmation hearings by the bully and the ecclesia during the term of office, impeachment, isangelia, public account of office in the court at the end of the term, that's called euthina. Now imagine modern times if every official after leaving office would go through a trial. We would have no politicians today. Liturgies, liturgia, or direct wealth tax in the form of public service required of the wealthiest Athenians and medics in the form of chorigia or a triarchy, and ostracism, ostracismos, the most remarkable. Ostracism, the duration of it was from 507 to 416, 415 BC. According to the rules of the ostracism, once a year the Athenians would be asked if they would desire for a citizen to be expelled from the city-state, and then 2 months later, if they replied yes, 2 months later there would be, in a particular assembly, there would be the vote. Anyone having more than 6,000 votes would have to prepare, for a long journey away from home in 10 days, and then he would leave for 10 years. And the punishment for coming back before the end of the 10-year term would be death. Now, we have to remember this, that these people have done nothing wrong. Contrary to our modern judicial system, where you have the presumption of innocence, here you have a preemptive action to dismantle socio-political network of the individuals with strong influence, who could be potentially dangerous for democracy. Now, look at the shirts with the names Aristides, son of Lysimachos, Kimon, son of Miltiades, Pericles, son of Xanthippos, Themistocles, and so on and so forth. We have thousands of shirts in the Athenian Agora. So when we studied, we had paleographical studies on the shirts, hoping to see how the ancient Athenians would write, if they made grammatic mistakes and so on and so forth. It was to our great surprise that we found only 70 or 80 different hands there among thousands of shirts. So what was going on? We have party politics. We have organized political parties that would prepare shirts against their opponents and distribute them to the citizens and to their followers just before voting. So all this was quite well organized, and the whole thing came to an end when, at about 417, 416, things were so polarized that the leaders of the two major political parties, the conservatives, Nicias, and liberals, Alcibiades, realized that one of them would be expelled because of the polarization. So they got together and they agreed to instruct their followers to vote for a third person, someone who was relatively unknown. Hyperbolus was his name. He was a triarch and one of the demagogues, the more not important ones. So at that time, Hyperbolus was expelled with tens of thousands of votes. Nobody literally knew him. And therefore, the Athenians realized that the whole thing backfired, and ostracism was suspended in 416, 415 BC. Now, apart from the control mechanisms, we have innovative integrative mechanisms that the Athenian democracy employed to propagate its ideology, integrate and educate the civilians. Democracy employs realism. and embraces real time. Because democracy is based on the realistic admission that absolute power corrupts even the best of people. And democracy focuses on the present and the future, unlike monarchy and aristocracy that are legitimized by old traditions and constant references to the past. Democracy transitions from thesmos to nomos, which signifies the drastic change of a society based on customary law, aristocratic ideals, morals, ritual, reciprocity, to a society based on recorded law, equality, and justice. So nomos becomes an indispensable tool in the service of democracy. Also, democracy transitions from traditional conservatism to radical criticism of old ethos and past ideologies. Strong criticism and satire of current structures, ideas, and people through philosophy, oratory, and comedy becomes a pattern that serves democracy. As democracy emerges, the focus of philosophy also shifts from nature, cosmology, and cosmogony, what we call natural philosophy, to man himself. Remind you what Protagoras said, man is the measure of all things. So we have a shift from natural philosophy to political and ethics philosophy that targets political, socioeconomic, and ethical issues. Political and ethics philosophy becomes a great tool in the service of democracy. That is the equivalent, actually, the equivalent of this is the Enlightenment for the rebirth of democracy in the modern era. At the same time, there's a shift from abstract theoretical thought, from the inductive method to the empirical research, deductive method, to reasoning and factual analysis. The advancement of democracy also entails a transition from fiction to historical fact, as mythology yields to the authority and credibility of recorded historiography with Herodotus and history with Thucydides in the 5th century BC. Furthermore, rhetoric or oratory, necessary in the courts of law and for political debates in the public fora, which was developed by the sophists and professional public orators in the 5th and the 4th century BC. Rhetoric became an indispensable tool for democracy as well. The emergence of theater and dramatic poetry in the late 6th century became also an invaluable tool in the service of democracy. By contrast with epic poetry that glorified heroic deeds of nobility, and by contrast with lyric poetry that sang personal sentiments, tragedy addressed current problems of ethics, law, and justice, freedom, responsibility, and accountability, political and moral dilemmas through allegorical myths, and thus offering a new interpretation of the past to guide the present and the future, and a didactic message about the principles that sustain society and democracy. At the same time, comedy and satire ridiculed mythology and the old conservative ethos, ridiculed structures, ideas, institutions, political authority and hierarchy, private and family life, with strong profanity, obscenity, and the grotesque, thus expanding the right of free speech, the right of parousia, limited to the citizens. It expands the right of parousia to all Athenians that are able to criticize authority, and also it releases social tension. Therefore, theater functioned for democracy. It served democracy in a number of ways. It functioned as entertainment and education for the whole population without discriminative restrictions. For citizens and medics, free men and slaves, men and women, old and young, elite and the mass. And that's why Pericles instituted payment to citizens for attending theater. Theater also functioned as a social mechanism of cultural integration and social bonding, forging civic identity and crystallizing social ranking. And finally, theater served as a political mechanism by becoming an informal and wider extension of the public assembly, allowing not only the citizens, but all people to exercise the right of free speech, criticism, or disapproval, debate, and communicate ideas. Democracy also employed narrative art to illustrate and disseminate its political message. So we have a transition from generic and symbolic monosynic art, which was of aristocratic, timeless, and emblematic value, to narrative, polysynic, and polysemic art that we see, for example, on the frieze and the pediments of the Parthenon. We have a change from mythological themes that legitimize the aristocratic birthrights on the archaic black figure pottery, for example, to everyday life scenes, sexual scenes, athletic scenes, and so on and so forth, that illustrated the life of the common citizens. That's on the classical Attic red figure pottery. The clientele has changed. Now it is the common citizens that buy the pots and want to see themselves on the pottery. And finally, we have elimination or replacement of politically charged symbols. We have Heracles replaced by Theseus. Heracles was associated with Pisistratus. Or the archaic Kouroi and the Kore, the beautiful statues, were banned because they were landmarks of aristocracy. Don't forget that narrative art, the equivalent of this, that served democracy, served the Athenian democracy, the equivalent for this for modern times, for the rebirth of democracy, is the Renaissance. Finally, the Athenian democracy organized annual processions, festivals, and public events or mass participation. And they used them systematically to culturally integrate the population through collective social memory, to forge common civic identity and reaffirm hierarchy. A very good example is the Panathenaic procession, the so-called Pombi. It connects like a human thread the past, that is the cemetery, and the ancestors from the Dipylon cemetery, the present, which is the Agora, and the timeless future, which is the Acropolis and the gods. And that brings us to the last part of our lecture, which is the political pathology of democracy. Pathogenic traits catalysts caused extensive political ankylosis in the late 5th and 4th centuries BC. What are these traits catalysts? The polarization between mass and elite, and a huge power struggle between them. The emergence of demagogues and populism. Prosopocentric political parties, not formed on principles or ideology. The lack of continuity of government. Judicial system failure. Poor education, apathy and indifference, decreasing political participation of citizens. Most of these features we see in our modern democracies. Internal corrosion and changing historical conditions caused the decline and fall of democracy 3 centuries later, and the subsequent absorption of the city-states by the Hellenistic kingdoms and the Roman Empire. The decline of democracy entailed arbitrary reconceptualization of terms, depreciation of values, and delegitimization of institutions, which again we see in our democracies in the 21st century. As Thucydides insightfully describes in book 382:4, they, the demagogues, changed the established meaning of words to fit their actions. Και την ιωθείαν αξίωση των ονομάτων στα έργα αντίλαξαν τη δικαιώση. Even more stunning is, a century later, the statement of Isocrates, an Athenian orator of the 4th century, who poignantly remarks that, and read it carefully, our democracy is getting self-destroyed, for it abused the right of freedom and of equality, for it taught the citizens to regard insolence as a right, illegality as freedom, impertinence as equality, and anarchy as happiness. Isocrates describes our democracies, and it was not only him that criticized democracy and the political pathology of democracy. Look at other different critics of democracy. Friedrich Schiller, votes should be weighed, not counted. Mencken, democracy is a pathetic belief in the collective wisdom of individual ignorance. Winston Churchill, the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. Alain de Benoit, the most important indicator for democracy is neither the degree of freedom nor the degree of equality, but rather the degree of participation. And more importantly, John Adams, US president. Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. Isocrates' statement stands alarmingly too close to the prophetic aphorism of John Adams. Likewise, modern democracies in the Western world today appear to run the same suicidal course, being tantalized by phobic or incompetent leadership, by demagogy and populism, by a strong polarization between globalism on one hand and identitism on the other, by massive illegal immigration, by a destructive multiculturalism, by immoderate rightism of minorities, by obsessive political correctness, the woke culture, the cancel culture even against ancient texts, trying to forbid, the texts of Shakespeare or, the Iliad and the Odyssey as not conforming to our own today's standards. By education that produces masses of voters instead of free-thinking citizens, inevitably fear or worse, apathy of the citizens and voters. Are we repeating old mistakes? Are we heading towards the same dead end? Well, to navigate forward and find solutions, shape our future, we need first to study our past. And in my view, the future of democracy, we can combine many different solutions, but in the core, it is education. Education is what turns mirrors into windows. It prepares thinking citizens, and it reinforces democracy. The problem with today's education in our Western democracies is that we teach the students what to think, and it's the reverse. We should teach the students how to think, not what to think. They need to gain knowledge, they need to gain understanding and critical ability, not just for the sake of it, but in order to act. Education is not just theory, it is praxis-oriented. So a democracy is as strong, just like a chain, it is as strong as each of its links. And each citizen, each link of this chain should be educated properly and developing not just knowledge and understanding, but also critical ability. And I think that's in the main core. Whatever solution we choose will be short-term. The long-term solution, in my opinion, is exactly what we're doing at the IWP and very, very few other universities around the world, where we're trying to create free-thinking citizens and free-thinking, professionals. And that, I think, is the best pillar and the best foundation to salvage democracy and use it as best as possible for the future. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Professor Megides. If anyone has a question, please use the Q&A function at the top of the Teams window rather than the raise hand function, please. I see we have a raised hand, so we'll just give them some time to type it out in the Q&A.
Until we see the question, let me remind you that our students, the IWP students, also have the great opportunity to follow the steps of our ancient Greek ancestors and study political philosophy and history and warfare and diplomacy in Greece through the Hermes program. So I think that's a great opportunity, a great advantage to do what we're doing best, in Washington, D.C., to do it the very same thing in Athens and connect, the ancient democracy with modern democracy.
Yes, and we have Adele on the call who can help connect students to the Greek program if she would like to say anything about that.
Yes, the Greece program is a tremendous opportunity for students, for interns. We will be going to Greece this summer, probably in late May through mid-June. Get to travel around the country, see all these amazing places that you learn about in your courses, really get a sense of the history coming alive and how it relates to modern problems. We're hoping to have a information session, hopefully in the first week of December. You'll receive information about that via email. Please, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Happy to answer any questions you might have about the program. And hope to see you at that for more information.
Thanks, Adele.
Thank you very much, Adele. We also have a question coming in. It says, so this paints a pretty gloomy outlook for democracy in the US. Where do you think we are headed in the US?
Well, it's not just for the US. It's in Europe as well. The phenomenon is not localized. It's widespread. And it's, in most democracies, we see a combination of all these problems. We see, the populism. We see demagogues, and lack of judicial failure. We see all the same pathogenic traits, catalysts that really dissolved the ancient Athenian democracy 2,300 years. No, it's gloomy. I agree. I'm very pessimistic about how we're going and how we're moving, forward, because we're not really moving forward. In my opinion, we're moving in circles and making the very same mistakes. And the only way to get out of this is completely change the education for the next generations. Our generation is already gone, it's lost. And we can salvage whatever we can, but we need to preserve the future. Our students are the next generation, and we need to do a good job offering them, the tools to preserve democracy and make it better. Democracy is not, at a stage, it's not something standing, it's moving always. It continuously rediscovers itself, redefines itself, because democracy is what I described, a fine balance between antithetical, traits and antithetical interests to find a compromise. It is the most fragile constitution. So by being so fragile, it is very susceptible to destruction. The only way that would avert its destruction is proper education.
Wonderful. We have another question that's come in. It is, what do you see as the tipping point of the downfall of democracy for Athens? And what could they have done to intervene? I see this lesson as one we need to take action on now.
Okay. I think in the 5th century, they made a huge mistake. Actually, it could have not been a mistake. I was recently studying again and again and again the life of Alcibiades, an amazing man, amazing politician, without ethics. And the Athenian democracy entrusted him and then betrayed him. And that caused, his betrayal of Athens twice. and twice he came back and saved Athens again and again. The problem with this is that Athens identified its future with the future of one man. And that was a problem. This is Alcibiades was a great politician, but also a great demagogue. His negatives are almost as many as his positives, by contrast with Pericles, who was a leader, not a pedagogue. And that, I think, with Alcibiades starts, the downfall of Athens, because they identify the whole city-state with the fate of one man and the desires of one man. And I think we have several, similar problems in modern democracies as well. We had them in Greece, and the same thing in several European countries. And the United States. So, in my opinion, that was a tipping point, and that could be a tipping point for modern democracies when we entrust too much power to a single man that might completely change the fine balances of democracy. We always have to stick and be careful with the checks and balances.
Thank you again. Another question is, do you place importance, the way John Adams did, on the difference between a democracy and a republic?
Well, it's two different things, obviously. And it's not a coincidence that our forefathers in the United States opted for a system that's closer to the republic rather than democracy. They knew how democracy ended its cycle by, collapsing by itself internally from internal corrosion. So obviously, the system of the republic offers, more safeguards against such an internal collapse. We see the difference, and that is why in most countries today, perhaps with the exception of Switzerland, where we have a tendency for wider voting, they vote, important things massively in a kind of a direct democracy. In all the other democracies, we really have a republic. Now, it was not just our forefathers that made that choice, between democracy and the republic. It was also a choice that was made by the Spartans. If you study the Spartan constitution, well, the Spartan state, it combines the advantages of monarchy, of aristocracy, and democracy. You've got two kings, one at home, always one expedition. You've got the power of aristocracy through the Senate, and then you have the appella, which is, and the 5 efforts, the executive power, and the appella, the legislative power. So you have a very intriguing combination of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, which was very difficult for the Greeks, the rest of the Greeks, to understand it. But remember this: the Spartan state lasted from the 7th century BC to the Roman times. It lasted twice as long as the Athenian democracy.
Thank you again. The next question is education, as the answer seems a bit long-term. What can we do in the immediate future? Also, is this a sales pitch for classical education? I'm a student of history myself, but can see the need also for more useful subjects like engineering. A spread across disciplines seems to be the best outcome. So if the target is reduction of arts, then I agree, but not necessarily to force everyone to study the humanities.
No, you're absolutely right. The problem is that our students don't study the basic principles of political science and humanities while they are in high school. As a first year, I had a class in the first year students when I was teaching at another college, and I gave them the very same test I took when I became a citizen in the United States, and they all failed the test. You can't have a democracy like this. If your citizens don't really know, what the United States is and what it stands for, how the Constitution works. So this has to start from very early on, from the primary school, the elementary school, and the high school. You need to prepare the students in understanding what citizenship means, what humanities is, history, classics, and then to a certain degree, and then they can choose to do further studies when they grow up, when they go into the college or the university. Of course, not everybody will study, or not everybody will know Greek, or not everybody will know Latin, but at least they should read much of this in their own languages, if not from the original. So, and as you say, education is a long-term solution. The short term, if you ask for my opinion for the short term, strict checks and balances. Democracy is more in danger from falling from within. The strongest castles fall from within, not from the enemy outside the gates, but from the enemy within the gates. So strict checks and balances, better function of democracy, in terms of the judicial system, the separation of tripartite separation of executive, judicial, and legislative, and eventually this will obliterate demagogy and populism. And with the help of well-educated citizens, we might have a turn in what seems to be, a fast track towards a dead end.
Thank you. The next question is, could we make connections between ancient Greek sophists and demagogues with today's populist political parties?
There is a strong difference. I mean, the sophists were actually teaching on how to speak and how to involve, pathos and logos and all the other elements, were the early orators. And, you can call them demagogues, but actually demagogy and populism came slightly later. It was a byproduct of this act. I mean, the end result, the end product of the sophists is something admirable. It is how to use the speech to convince, how to use logic, how to use argumentation to convince. And that you need it in public fora, and you need it in the courts of law. Now, this is a tool. How we use the tool, we can't blame the sophists. Okay? We need to blame the politicians, the demagogues, who used it not to lead, but to be led by the people. So the issue, a leader does not say to his people, the pretty things, things that will make him, pleasant and favorable. On the contrary, it gives them reality, and reality and truth can be very, very painful sometimes. So that's the big difference between a demagogue and a leader. The sophists were neither. They were not leaders, they were not demagogues. They created the tool.
Thank you. The next question is, education going forward is being shaped and challenged by artificial intelligence. Do you see AI as helpful or more of a challenge in advancing the state of democracy?
Well, that's the same. Actually, I would answer the same way. This is a great tool. It's how we use it that will make the difference. If you use it to write your papers and plagiarize, it won't do you any good. If you use it instead of using your brain to come up with something new, because AI will not give you something new so far. It will give you a great combination of these things that we have improvised. Eventually, most probably, and very, very, shortly, we're going to see AI inventing things. Most probably. The issue is that AI is not an obstacle and shouldn't be an obstacle. It's a great tool, but just like every other tool, we need to use it sensibly and responsibly and with accountability. Most citizens in most democratic countries love the word right, privilege, freedom. They hate the word accountability. So using this tool has responsibilities and has accountability. I think if we use it properly, it's going to be a great tool in the hands of democracy.
Thank you. The next question is, how do you think we can improve critical thinking to our general public and to our youthful voters, especially today and especially during their college years?
Okay, let me take you here. A very good question as well. Very good questions, all of them, and I enjoy, all these questions. Let me go back to this. When you had the papyrus scroll or the pergamene scroll, in order to find something and study it, you had to unroll it. It usually would take, 3 or 4 tables long. So you needed to start reading until you found what you wanted. And by doing this, you would gain knowledge because you would read a lot of different things that were not directly related with what you're looking. The invention of the codex from the 1st century AD, and especially in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, was an advancement because you could store, things easier. It was cheaper, but also you could find things easier. You would read a couple of chapters, but you wouldn't need to read the whole book. So this great knowledge that you would gain from reading, the manuscripts of the papyrus scroll becomes a bit more narrowed down. Today, you have the computer, you Google something, and with a hit of a button, you get information that's unchecked and uncertified and without getting any context around it. That's not knowledge. That's information. And not always, actually, most times, it's not even verified information. So that's a big difference. That's what we should teach the young students and young people. A big difference between being informed and being educated. Information is just one stage in education. It's not education. So they need to be informed, but they also need to be educated. They need to get the context, and education is not just gaining knowledge or information, it is understanding it, contextualizing it, and only then you can get to the point of critical thinking. You can't get to critical thinking unless first you understand things, you gain knowledge, you understand things, and then you combine them. So it is a very complex, procedure, and it's a hard procedure, especially for young people, because they want to do other things, and they want to swallow chewed food, and that's the mistake we're making. We give them chewed food. That's the biggest mistake an educator can do. They need to discover the truth, just like Socrates. We have the truth inside our brains. We should help them take it out, like giving birth.
Thank you again. We have time for one more question, which is, it sounds as though democracy will fail eventually of its own momentum, but there are in the US force of socialism and communism, which are forcing the issue as well. If our leaders can communicate how communism is a dead end, would our republic have a better chance to persist?
Well, similar forces are everywhere. I remind you that in Greece we have it's one of the very few countries that has a communist party, and they don't call themselves Greek communists. they call themselves the Communist Party of Greece. The word ethnic or the word homeland or the word Greeks, excites them negatively. So the problem is that the problem with democracy, if you can call it a problem, is that it is a compromise of many different things in order to get to through concessions to a compromise. The problem is that by doing so, democracy has to accept within its embrace even the voices of those who directly oppose it. And you can't avoid this. Is inevitable, because if you start moving voices out of the range, and then you focus on specific voices, then you stop having a democracy, unfortunately. And that makes it a very fine, a very delicate, and a very fragile constitution. Now, with educated citizens who understand what they hear and they vote accordingly, those left wings, the communists, or fascists, or other extreme voices will die out, because they will have people who, when they hear what they say, they will reject it. They will think about it, go through critique, and through their critical ability, they will disregard it. The problem lies not to those who, raise these voices. The problem lies with us who receive these voices. Are we capable enough, are we educated enough to discern between what is threatening for democracy and what is not?